So up first today, a very potentially controversial segment because I thought that I had a take. I had a take on the Batman. Now, most people love the Batman. They love it. They love it. I like it. I like it. But I do think it has one major issue that I'll get into a little bit more here. I've already created one video on the How Stories Work channel. I'll talk a little bit more about that today. But I also heard that, conservative pundit, for lack of a better term, conservative pundit, conservative idealist, Ben Shapiro did not like it. And it made me wonder if we had some of the same issues or if his issues were different than mine or how that was going to play out. So do I agree with Ben Shapiro? Well, let's find out, shall we? I won't play his entire video today, by the way. So if you want to see his entire review, you can watch that on his channel. He has the rights to that content. I'm just going to show a few clips here and there and then respond to some of the things that he brings up in his review. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. Now, remember, I'm coming at this from a Batman fan, but also from the point of view of someone who writes stories. And so one of the things that I'm always looking for is what's set up in this story delivered upon? Does it make sense? Does it live into what I think that the creators were intending? So we're just going to play some clips from Ben Shapiro's review of the Batman, and then I'm going to be reacting to some of that. The first clip we have coming up here is a 40-second clip, and we'll take a look at it together right now. Let's go full screen here. Let's check it out.
All righty, folks. So last night I went and I saw The Batman. My review of that is coming up in just one moment. This video is sponsored by Ring. So last night I went and saw The Batman, went and saw it with my wife. It is 1 million hours long. And it's one of those movies where I started off and I was like, okay. And then I got a little further in. I was like, all right. And then I got to the end. I was like, meh. And then the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. And so you're about to hear a lot of hot takes on The Batman because I hate this movie.
So there you go. There's our first portion of what he's talking about here, where he says he hates this movie. And let's talk about some of the things that he likes, because he goes on to describe some of the things that he really likes about the movie. But there's only one thing that he really, really likes about this movie, and that is he likes the look and the tone of the film. He does sort of compliment the music and the performances. He says that are basically kind of just okay, except for he really did like the Riddler and the Penguin performances. So he liked those. So what's my response to those aspects of this? Well, I think that we do agree on the look and tone of the film. I think that that's fantastic. I had no issues there at all. In fact, I think that what Matt Reeves creates in the tone and the feel of Gotham is fantastic. There's a little bit of Nolan in there, primarily because he's shooting the same city. They're both shooting Chicago, although he includes some aspects of Liverpool, which gives it more of a Gothic feel at times, which is fantastic and I think is appropriate. So I actually prefer Matt Reeves's characterization of Gotham even over and above Nolan's characterization of Gotham. And it sort of feels like a mix between Nolan and what we got on the early days with Tim Burton. So I like that part of it a lot. I think we disagree. We disagree pretty strongly on the music. He kind of partially liked the music. I really liked the music. I thought the use of, it's kind of on trend to like the 1990s right now and see throwbacks to the 1990s. And one of the things that I think is done here in this film is that it feels like a lot of 1990s aesthetics, and I think the music adds really well to that. So I really like the music. I think Giacchino's actually a really good composer. Now, he did say that as far as performances go, I'm going to break down a couple of the performances. I think Pattinson's performance as Batman is good. I think it's good. I think it's we're not asking him to do anything that's super outside the realm of what we know of this kind of Batman, right? This great detective, but very, his only emotion is anger for the most part. So we're not seeing like a lot of range here, and I think that that's okay. It's not necessarily my favorite kind of Batman, but I do think it sets up future movies using Robert Pattinson, who's a fantastic actor. We just watch something like The Lighthouse, and you can see how good of an actor he is. I think it's setting him up for better, more nuanced roles in this character for Batman in the future. Kravitz's Catwoman, Shapiro says it's okay. I've seen this film twice. I think Kravitz's performance as Catwoman is great. I actually think that she displays a lot more emotional range as she's asked to as a character in this story. She's asked to be sort of, you can look at this film through Catwoman's eyes as how most people feel about Gotham. And that has its own problems, advantages, and disadvantages. She's willing to do things that she probably should not be willing to do, but a lot of people in Gotham are. That's why Gotham is so corrupt. So I think that she does a really good job of like, I want good things to happen, but I'm willing to do bad things to make that happen. So I thought that was really good. I liked her performance a lot. One of my favorite performances, and I totally disagree with, this is a strong disagreement with Ben Shapiro here, is that Turturro's performance as Falcone, I think, is amazing. And this is the same guy who played the butler in Mr. Deeds. Sneaky, sneaky, sir. You know, like this guy. That's the same guy who's playing Falcone. And Falcone seems like he controls a lot of things in this film. So I have a strong disagree with Ben Shapiro there. I think Falcone, played by John Turturro, is amazing. Now, I think he liked Dano's performance as the Riddler, and I think he liked it a lot more than I did, because I think that this is, now, don't get me wrong, I think Paul Dano is doing a fantastic job with what he was asked to do for this character. For me, it felt a little bit too psychotic. I think it felt a little bit too over the top psychotic, and I would have like made it a little bit more subdued and made him seem like not a character who's so unhinged, but rather a character who's super intelligent. I mean, the guy's an accountant, right? And obviously he's lashing out against this corruption in the city, but I would have made that much more subdued and had his behavior be really targeted towards things that were corrupt and like revealing different aspects of what was going on. I think he gets a little bit unhinged at parts, and that doesn't, I wouldn't have done it that way. It's not bad. It's not bad. It's certainly not, I would never say it was bad. I just would have taken it in a different direction. And then he says Farrell's performance is excellent as Penguin. I agree that Colin Farrell's performance as Penguin is awesome. In fact, it's almost impossible to tell that it's Colin Farrell. There's only moments where you can kind of hear a Colin Farrell-esque voice there. So, you know, I have some agreements and disagreements there, but, you know, nothing too big. So I'm going to fast forward ahead to the 3-minute mark, and we'll see what Ben Shapiro has to say here about this next segment.
And herein lies the main problem with the film. The biggest problem with the film is that the film hates Batman.
The film hates Batman.
$99 drone over established drone brands. There's a tiny US drone.
The film hates Batman.
Like the actual Batman character hates the Batman character. And this drives me up an absolute wall. The biggest problem with the film is not the wokeness. Yes, there's some.
Okay, so he says that, and then he gets into some other things before he addresses that big problem. So let's get into some of the other things that he addresses first in the next portion of this. So he says that there's a mischaracterization of the Batman, and then he brings up there's some wokeness, which is not a major complaint of his, but he brings up the wokeness. So let me just explain some of those things that he says are woke elements, and we'll break those down a little bit. He mentions, so, and I want to be fair to Ben, because I don't want to ever miscategorize anybody. He's not super annoyed by the wokeness. He brings it up. He discusses it a little bit. That's not his main complaint. So we're not going to spend a ton of time here, but what he says is woke is basically that the characters of the characters that are portrayed by people of color are all portrayed as good characters. That's Catwoman, Gordon, and the new mayor. And then he says that the white characters are all portrayed as bad characters. And again, I want to give him credit. He's not saying that this is a major issue. He's just saying that it's something that appears in the film. Now, I have a slightly different take on this. So I disagree with him here. And here's why I disagree with this particular categorization, is that the setup of this film is that Gotham is insanely corrupt. And that's from government officials at the top all the way to just your street level criminals. And that's not uncommon for Gotham. That's incredibly common for Gotham. So the existing political infrastructure is corrupt, and that happens to be predominantly white, at least in this version of Gotham. Gordon and the mayoral candidate, who I can't remember her name, but she's a mayoral candidate who's running up against the mayor who is killed in the beginning of this film. They are definitely cleaner characters, right? They don't have as many associated weaknesses or things that they're involved in that are inherently corrupt. But I would also argue that those characters are barely important to this overall story. The mayoral candidate in general just serves as an alternative to the corruption that has existed prior in the city, and someone who's trying to overcome that by having a president or a mayoral campaign. So I don't think you can necessarily say she's good. I just don't think we know enough about her to say like, oh, she's really good. She does seem better than what exists, but what exists is being shown to us as corrupt and criminal and having major issues all the way down with this existing political infrastructure. So sure, you could say that she seems good, but I mean, she's such a minor character that any minor character can kind of seem good. Now, I think that Catwoman is interesting, but I don't think we could ever call Catwoman good. I think Catwoman is the person we see Gotham through her eyes, and we see like, well, this is clearly bad and this is clearly bad. But don't forget, Catwoman is willing to do things that are also contributing to Gotham's problems. I mean, she's robbing from people. She, at several points of the film, is willing to kill people. So, I don't think that you can call her good. You can maybe call her like chaotic good, where she's doing some things that are maybe not things that we would think you should do, but she's doing them for good reasons. You could say that. But again, I think the portrayal of Catwoman is, first of all, it's very comics accurate, in my opinion. Obviously, whenever we talk about Batman comics, saying something's comics accurate is like, well, which comics are you talking about? Because there's a plethora of comics to choose from. But I do think that in general, her portrayal of Catwoman is fantastic. To me, the setup here is more about existing political and societal infrastructure, and that being the status quo, versus new thinking and ways of changing what Gotham should be, right? So it's not necessarily about wokeism versus maybe what you'd call like conservatism or something along those lines. I think it's really more about existing infrastructures and existing systems versus new thinking that is rebelling against this corrupt part of the system. So the legacy political societal landscape is slightly older and white, but to me, given Gotham's history, that's not necessarily surprising. Like, that's not something that I would look at and be like, oh, well, clearly this is more woke than every other Batman comic, right? Like, it seems like a lot of the Batman comics that infrastructure exists in that way. And I think too, if you talk about both Batman and the Riddler, two white characters, they're trying to help topple Gotham's corruption. So it's not just, people who are a little bit more woke who are trying to topple this existing corruption. You also have people who are also shown as white characters who are fighting the white infrastructure. So I just don't know if that argument holds a lot of weight for me personally. And again, I got to give credit where credit is due. He's not complaining a lot about this. He's just saying that this exists. And by the way, I think you can even argue that, Gordon isn't 100% good either. So one of the things he was saying was the mayoral candidate, Gordon, and Catwoman are shown to be the good characters. But I mean, even Gordon is enlisting the help of a vigilante in Batman, like, right? Like, so if you're a person who's like, they would lean, let's call it woke, right? They would be saying like, we should defund the police. Well, you're definitely anti-Batman. Like, the last thing you want is someone running around the streets, a white guy in a costume running around the streets doing whatever he wants to, especially with weaponry and so forth. And even when you look at the street level criminals, I mean, some of the street level criminals we see are white, but some of those street level criminals we see are people of color. So I don't know. I mean, I know that there are phrases in the movie that are used that I think, Catwoman has a phrase in this film that, old white guys with privilege or something along those lines. But that's like a line that someone would say. Like, so that's like kind of reflecting some of what reality is in our current environment. So now I will say this. If we were to go on and see in a sequel film, which I'm sure we're going to get because this film has been doing really well. If we were going to go on and see a sequel film and they delved into the new mayor's background a little bit more, and she was completely uncorrupt and had no weaknesses and had no she was just a completely clean, everything works out great character, then I think that you might have more of an argument to be made there, is that that maybe we're getting along the lines of not being able to showcase things quite fairly, because every character should have weaknesses and every character should be tempted to do wrong, and no character is going to act in ways that are I mean, maybe Superman because he's the ultimate Boy Scout, but very, very few characters, I should say, are going to be not tempted to be doing something that's incorrect there. So, and again, to be fair to Ben, he's not really like super upset about this specific point, but I would say, like, I'm not sure that I see the same amount of wokeness that he sees, and I do have a pretty sensitive woke meter. Let's see what he has to say coming up here in the next part of this.
Up like a bat and go around beating up criminals. It's not answered, and the director doesn't know, and the writer doesn't know.
So let me go back.
Always for film lefty Twitter, but the main theme is not a throwaway. The main theme is what matters here. The film despises Batman. So every Batman iteration has to explain why a man who is a billionaire would dress up like a bat and go around beating up criminals. It's not answered, and the director doesn't know, and the writer doesn't know, and this is the problem. So in the Nolan,
so interesting, and he's going to go into describing the Nolan's universe, and I'll describe that here a little bit as well. But this is a really interesting point, because basically what he's saying is, why is Batman, aka Bruce Wayne, why is he doing what he's doing? So let's break down a little bit of his argument here. One, he's using Nolan's movies as a comparison, and also notes that Nolan's movies are the best Batman movies. I'm going to partially agree with that, but I'll talk about that in a bit. He does point out that that Nolan's Batman had to become Batman to fight crime and cause criminals to fear him, because no amount of money could be used to fight crime. So he had to actually fight back against crime by causing criminals to fear the symbol of Batman. And I would say that's a pretty good assessment. So yeah, excellent assessment, Ben. That is exactly what is happening in The Dark Knight, or the Batman Begins and The Dark Knight. What Batman is doing is he's saying, I need to become a symbol of justice. And in order to become a symbol of justice, I can't do what my dad did, what Thomas Wayne did, and infuse money into that system, because criminals don't fear the money. Oftentimes they'll just use the money. They'll somehow get access to that money and use it to their own ends. So it's not preventing the heinous crimes that are happening. Okay, so what am I going to do? Well, I have to make the criminals fear me. I have to make the criminals fear to do the thing that we don't want them to do in Gotham. And so therefore I'm going to become Batman. So I think that's a good assessment. I think Ben's take there is really strong. Now, he says that there is no reason, though, as to why Pattinson, this Matt Reeves, Robert Pattinson Batman, is doing what he's doing. I'm going to keep saying Pattinson, by the way, just so we can delineate between the Nolan Batman and the Reeves Batman. So why is Pattinson doing what he's doing? So here's my response to this line of thinking from Ben Shapiro. While I agree that Nolan's first two films, Batman Begins and The Dark Knight, are superior to the Batman, I do think that the Batman is maybe a little bit better, if not a lot better in some people's eyes, especially, and in my own eyes, I think I would say that it's better than the third film, The Dark Knight Rises. That film actually, I think, has some of the same issues that this film does, honestly, in some ways. There's some comparisons to be made there. But Batman Begins and The Dark Knight, I do think, are the best Batman films. He calls them the best superhero films. I don't know that they're the best superhero films, but they're certainly near the top. I like Guardians of the Galaxy a lot. Really love Man of Steel too. That's up there. The Wonder Woman film, that's up there for me. And I like Zack Snyder, right? So a lot of people do not like Zack Snyder. They hate it when I say that, but I really like Zack Snyder. So a lot of his films I am a big fan of. So I think he's like, he's on to something there, but he's not exactly on the same page as I am. Now, let's break down Batman's why in The Batman, because he's saying that there is no why, that the writers don't know what Batman's why is, and nor does the director. And I actually disagree with that. And here's why. Thomas Wayne in The Batman started the renewal project, but that renewal project has not worked. The renewal project was an influx of funds, because Thomas Wayne is a billionaire, an influx of funds into Gotham to try and solve some of Gotham's problems. But clearly Gotham still has massive problems. So the renewal project has not worked at all. And so the question is, why has it not worked? And that is what both the Riddler and the Batman are attempting to solve in this film. So, like in the Nolan universe, money doesn't solve Gotham's problems. There's no amount of money that's going to solve the problems that exist in Gotham City. So I agree with Ben's take that Bale's Batman needs to create a symbol of justice. I disagree with his take, though, that Pattinson, Robert Pattinson's Batman, doesn't have a why. So here's my thinking about how that works. Since the renewal project did not work, Thomas Wayne's legacy did not work. In fact, some of his legacy is even called into question in this film as to whether he did things out of a corrupt kind of perspective, or whether he did them out of a justice sort of perspective. And different people have different. Falcone has one feeling about that, and Alfred has a different feeling about that. By the way, special call out to Andy Serkis. Not necessarily my favorite Alfred. However, this dude has been in Marvel. This dude has been in DC. This dude has been in King Kong. This dude has been in Star Wars. He played Snoke in Star Wars. And he was in Lord of the Rings. Andy Serkis is like a geek hero at this point, right? Like, certainly is an awesome character. So thank you, Andy Serkis, for being involved in all of our favorite properties here. So not only did Thomas Wayne's legacy not work in Gotham, but in fact, Thomas Wayne was murdered in Gotham. He got caught up in the crime that he was trying to prevent and or solve. So Pattinson's Batman is doing what he's doing because very few people in Gotham actually understand the issues that the city faces. And when you don't understand a problem, it's impossible to really solve it the right way. When you don't understand what the root of the problem is, you will do things that Catwoman is doing. Now, we can look at Catwoman and say, yeah, Catwoman is doing some things that I would have done. She's stealing from the corrupt people. She's trying to fight for the little guy. However, in doing those things, she's perpetuating the system of corruption that she's involved in, right? And so what I would categorize that as is that Catwoman doesn't understand the real problem and is thus trying to solve some of the other problems that exist in her own way, as opposed to solving the root of the problem. So I think that Batman in this film thinks that by becoming a detective, the world's greatest detective, as we know in the comics, he can effectively figure out what's making Gotham so corrupt and then solve the problem that way. So it's not the same. He has not yet created the full Bale Batman excuse yet. He hasn't fully lived into, I need to create the symbol so that I can. Now he acknowledges that he's already become a symbol, because whenever the bat symbol is displayed, people do fear him and they show that. But he's still thinking that he might need to be vengeance. He just doesn't know what the problem is yet. And so he's, I think that's really, when it comes down to it, though, him becoming a better detective is his why, so that he can figure out how to solve Gotham's problems. It just so happens that by being that detective, he has to be really aggressive, because he's going to be dealing with the dozens of Gotham's underworld. And so I do think that the director and the writer understands Pattinson's motivation, and I do believe they understand his why. So Ben says that's never explained, but I would argue that it's actually heavily implied, and so I would disagree with him there. Batman's why is discovering, by becoming the world's greatest detective, why Gotham has so many problems and what is the core of that problem. And now, why is that important to him? Because his parents were killed by Gotham's violence, and so therefore he wants to solve Gotham's violence. And that does set up the vengeance take that Pattinson will ultimately fail at, because it's not the correct way to solve this particular problem, right? I also will say that that Ben Shapiro in this review goes on to say that Batman and Bruce Wayne are essentially the same character. And I agree that it doesn't feel quite like the right Batman, or the Batman that we expect to see. Again, in the comics, there's many different versions of Batman. And it does not also feel like the right Bruce Wayne. But I also think that this is a much younger Batman. He's got things to learn. This is not somebody who shows up with, I'm Batman, I've been doing this for 10 years, I know what the game is, I know how to play the game. This is a Batman that's very early on in his career. So this is okay. I don't think he knows how to use the Bruce Wayne character versus how to use the Batman character yet. He hasn't even come up with a definition of that, because he still doesn't know why Gotham's problems are so bad. This is what this movie is trying to expose. So I think that Pattinson's Batman actually feels like Nolan's Bruce Wayne before he became Batman. This is when he was going to go, when he had the gun on him, and he was going to go shoot one of the people in the trial. He feels like that kind of character. He's just a little bit further along because he's already become Batman. And he kind of wants revenge. He wants vengeance. This is part of what he says he's all about. So I have no problem with that. I actually disagree with his points there. Now let's skip ahead to a little further in the video and see what Ben's next take is. We're going to go about to 7:50 here. We'll play it from right here.
A lot. That's pretty much all he does. He's a bad detective. He doesn't do anything. The plot is that all these people get killed. Batman uncovers it. He realizes that his dad was corrupt also, or that his dad engaged in corruption with Carmine Falcone. Finally, we get to the end. Paul Dano does it's such a ripoff of Seven. He gives himself up.
You're going to get another ad here. This podcast is not sponsored by pizza, but if you feel like having a pizza, do it.
Batman does not prevent a single one of these deaths. Batman, in fact, is complicit in one of the deaths by accident. And he doesn't actually capture the Riddler because he's clever. The Riddler gives himself up by sitting at a diner and getting arrested.
This is interesting. Okay, so this is interesting. This is an interesting Ben take, which we're going to dive a little bit deeper into. And this is where he's saying that the Batman doesn't actually solve any problems or prevent any crime that the Riddler is perpetrating. You could argue that he does help prevent some of the chaos at the very end of the film that Riddler's followers are trying to perpetrate. But other than that, yeah, I mean, he's not wrong here. Batman is failing a lot on his way to solving the end problem. So Riddler is succeeding in most everything, and Riddler's perspective that Batman is on his team is a very interesting one. And this is where, so I agree that this whole portion of the movie is a little bit awkward, but I also enjoy the fact that Batman is failing, because failure is what often teaches us to learn, especially heroes, right? Hero's journey is all about how do you keep failing while you move ahead into what you are going to become eventually. And so interesting takes there. And I think that he's basically right on. Batman's not solving any of those things. And that is awkward because we feel like Batman should be the greatest detective already. And we know that in this movie, he's not necessarily. He's working up towards that. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because this is where we really get into, this is the last segment I'm going to play of his review. Oh, actually, I got one more to play for his review. But we're getting into the root of the problem that Ben has with this film. So I'm going to skip ahead to 8:42 about, and we'll play that for a little bit. Here we go.
From City. And so Batman goes up there and he's beating people up. There comes a point where he's beating this guy and he's really like maybe beating him almost to death. And he stops and they take off that guy's mask and they say, "Who are you?" And the guy says, "I am vengeance." Okay, now this is the theme throughout the film. Ooh, the theme. Okay, so in order to explain why this is a problem, you have to now understand the character of the Riddler. So it says right at the beginning of the movie, "Who is Batman? I'm vengeance," right? He's just on the streets and he's beating people up.
I'm vengeance.
And then people keep calling him Mr. Vengeance for no apparent reason. Like we don't know why they're calling him that, because he never actually publicly says he's vengeance. It's in his creepy diary, which again is supposed to be a mirror image of the fact that the Riddler also keeps a Zodiac killer style diary. So they're supposed to be two halves of the same whole. Batman is beating up this follower of the Riddler's. He takes off his mask and the guy says, "I'm vengeance." And suddenly Batman realizes he can't be vengeance. That's not what he's meant to do. He's betrayed his mission. And so
interesting points here. Interesting points from Mr. Shapiro here. So let's just cover this again. What's Ben Shapiro's take here? Then we're going to play this clip a little bit longer and watch a little bit more of it. Everyone sees Batman as vengeance, and Batman claims to be vengeance. But then when Batman hears that the Riddler's followers are also claiming to be vengeance, right? He just explained that in that scene. We saw a little bit of a clip from it too. That Batman has this epiphany that like vengeance is wrong, right? Like that's the kind of the crux of this part of the story. Batman started out thinking vengeance was the right way to behave. As he's done his detective work, what he's realizing is that the problem in Gotham is not the same as what he thought it was, and therefore vengeance as a solution is probably not going to work. Now, I actually agree with Ben's assessment here that this is interesting. I think he's onto something, but also I don't have any problems with Batman learning that vengeance is bad or wrong, because vengeance is very bad and very wrong, right? Like that should be apparent. Like one of the things in Batman is, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, but one of the philosophies in Batman is that if Batman were to act out of vengeance because his parents were killed, out of his own trauma, is he has personal trauma, and then he puts that personal trauma back into the world in the form of vengeance. That is not justice. That is not heroic behavior. Other characters might do some of those kinds of things, but that is not actually what Batman does. Batman actually says, I had trauma. I want to prevent that trauma from happening to other people in Gotham, and therefore I'm going to become justice for Gotham. Notice the difference there. It's not a selfish act. It's a selfless act, right? He has to say, well, this happened to me. Now I need to get over it in order to help other people. So I think it's good that this message is embedded in the Batman, whereas Ben maybe thinks it's not good. But what we're going to now get into is something that I probably am far more in agreement with Ben Shapiro on than maybe some other people. So let's go ahead and play through about minute 10, a little after minute 10, and then we'll see what Ben's take is here.
He then descends on an electrified cable because he's trying to stop people from being electrocuted by this flying electrical wire. And he cuts off the cable. He's holding on to it. He falls down into the water. A rebaptism. He gets up, and then he proceeds to lead a bunch of people who are not really trapped, but kind of trapped, I suppose. And he leads them to, I guess, a safer place by carrying a torch. And then he goes up to the top of Madison Square Garden, and he is helping people be airlifted and medevaced out. And this is how he is learned fulfillment.
Gotham Square Garden, by the way, not Madison Square Garden. Although I can understand why he would say that, because it looks just like Madison Square Garden in a lot of ways. All right, so let's get into this, because now we're getting into. And I'm not going to play any other clips from Ben's video. Again, you should go watch Ben's video if you really want to see all of the nuances of his take. I'm trying to describe them here, and shout out to him for putting this video out there. But you know, I'm not going to show any more of it. You can go watch the rest of it and see what his full take is. I'll talk about some of it here, though. So Ben's take ultimately about what this movie is about and why he doesn't like it, why he actually hates it. We both saw him say that. We all saw him say that in the beginning of this clip, or heard him say it. This movie is about how fighting criminality or criminals isn't doing any good. And then Ben says, well, he has to stop being Batman because he can't fight criminals and actually has to become more like Superman. And he needs to save people as opposed to beating up bad guys. That's the character change that we see here. And he calls that a defund the police attitude. Ben calls it that. Ben calls it in his video a defund the police attitude. So Batman is supposed to be someone who protects innocents and targets criminals. And so Ben thinks that Matt Reeves hates Batman, and thus Ben hates the Batman. And that's basically his overall take. So do I agree with this aspect of Ben's take? I've agreed with some of the things he said. I've disagreed with some of the other things that he said. Well, the first thing I'll disagree with is I don't think this is about a defund the police attitude. I don't think that that's right. I talked about this earlier. A defund the police attitude would assume that no vigilante could ever exist, because you don't. I mean, I shouldn't say that. There's some people that would say communities should police themselves, but honestly, I don't think that that's about the police force. I think it's about the type of police force that exists, right? So that's different. But a vigilante who's just puts on a costume and has a lot of heavy weaponry and goes out into the populace to fight crime, I don't think that is a defund the police. I don't think that's one of their principles. Like, let's go fund vigilantes. I don't think that that's part of their thing. I do, though, totally agree with Ben Shapiro. I totally agree with him in terms of the characterization of Batman in the last few minutes of this film. Not really feeling like Batman to me. Now, have I already acknowledged and already agreed that he needs to learn that vengeance is not the right thing to do? Yes, I have acknowledged that. I agree with that. I think that Matt Reeves pointing that out is really important. I think that Matt Reeves pointing that out in 2022, where a lot of people want to take vengeance into their own hands on airplanes and stuff, it's a good message, actually. It's a good message. It's something we should think about, right? Especially when you see corruption, and which we see a lot of these days. So I agree that that's a good message. However, when we see Batman, he Ben mentioned him cutting the electrical wire, effectively saving some people because they're all in the water, and if the electrical cable fell in the water, they'd all be electrocuted. He cuts off the electrical wire. I kind of thought that he was going to have, by the way, when I was watching that scene unfold in the theater, I kind of thought that he was going to have like some lingering problem related to getting electrocuted, but of course he doesn't. It's just kind of not a big deal. And then he, like Ben said, he lights the torch, and then leads these people out from this water. A cool scene, by the way, cool looking scene. But so I don't have any problems with those things, because that's Batman showcasing to the populace that he's not just somebody who beats up other people. He also is here to do good things, right? I don't have a problem with that. So when I talk about it not feeling like Batman, what am I talking about? Well, at the end of the movie, when he's talking about how there's a voiceover, which voiceovers are always difficult to pull off well. I'll put it that way. A lot of writers actually will try to avoid voiceovers at all costs because they have major issues with them. I don't necessarily have major issues with them. We used a voiceover in our film, in our Star Wars fan film that we did. We used the voiceover there. But I do have an issue where he's talking about, I need to become hope. This is, in my opinion, I think, not what Batman is attempting to become. Nolan was much closer to saying, I need to become fear for the people who are perpetrating evil so that they will stop perpetrating evil. Batman's not becoming fear in the Nolan universe so that he can oppress a populace. He's using fear to make people make the right decision. It's no different than the laws we have in place, right? The laws we have in place are partially there to create fear from you disobeying them, right? Like, that's part of the reason why we have laws is that hopefully you won't go commit crimes because you're afraid of going to jail or having some bigger problem arise in your life here. So Ben calls this a fundamental betrayal of the character, and I think that that's partially true. I think that some of his logic here is actually sound. It's a partial betrayal of the character. Now, I'm talking about a much smaller piece of the film than Ben is. I'm talking about the voiceover where he says, I'm going to have to become hope, which I think is a very odd thing for him to say. So let me just say this. I love this film. Quite frankly, I love this film all the way up until we see Riddler in jail. And then from that point on, I think the film becomes a little less clear in what it's attempting to do. I don't mind the fact that there's the vengeance thing, that he needs to learn not to be vengeance. And when he sees other people saying that they're also going to be vengeance, it's a realization for a vigilante to say, oh, whoa, other people have heard me say I'm vengeance and look what they're doing, right? That's not good. In fact, in one of the Nolan movies, I believe it was The Dark Knight, people are dressing up like Batman to go beat up other people. So a realization, vengeance is not the thing that we're trying to do here. I also love the fact that it's dark and gritty. I love the music. We've already covered that. Batman is bitter, angry, and vengeful, but we know that Batman can't stay that way. So I like that aspect of it. The Riddler, besides the fact that I would probably have showcased him differently in this film, he actually serves as a good enemy here because Batman needs to see what it looks like to go too far when you're fighting corruption. That's great. That's great. Perfect portrayal of what that looks like. But in the end, I think that Ben is correct when he says that the concept of Batman is that in dealing with depravity, the depravity that exists in Gotham, the corruption, the injustice, the issues in Gotham, the question of Batman is not how do we provide people hope, but rather how do we create order out of chaos? That's different. Those are two different things. Superman is how can I show people what hope looks like and what people should be doing to showcase hope in their lives. That's different because Batman's character is never portrayed as a type of Christ, let's say. You would never look at Batman that way, but you might look at Superman sometimes that way because it's inherent in the character. In fact, the creation of Superman was very similar to saying, what would it look like if the Messiah, the character who's supposed to create a just and fair and equal society, which, by the way, is a different version than Jesus Christ as Messiah. I'm talking about more of a Jewish perspective of Messiah here. Superman is kind of that. He is. And that meaning hope, and if he looks like hope, that makes a lot of sense. Batman is distinctly not that, because Batman is about what is it okay to do in going about creating order. So imagine that Batman is more closely related to the First Order in Star Wars. The First Order takes it too far. They oppress, they come down on, they restrict people's freedoms. Batman says, in this super corrupt environment, how far do I have to fight back to overcome corruption? How far do I have to go to create a fear of doing evil so that we can create more order, so that the normal citizens who are doing the right things are not oppressed by the corrupt society? And the question of Batman is, when do you take order too far? And it's that tension of like freedom and like whether or not we should use violence and when we should use violence and what that looks like. Saying I'm going to become hope is, to me, I agree with Ben Shapiro, not what we actually expect out of Batman. Now, let's move on. Let's move on from this a little bit to say Batman is dealing with psychopaths a lot of times. What is Superman dealing with? Well, a lot of times he's dealing with existential threats or threats that are coming from a cosmic place or threats that are coming because someone like Lex Luthor is abusing the capitalist system. And in his abuse of the capitalist system, Superman's like, well, we got to create hope here because this is not the American way, right? Truth and justice is the American way for Superman. So I think that Ben Shapiro's onto something, but I have less of a problem with overarchingly what he's saying is going on here. I don't think it's as serious as he's saying it's going on, but I do think it's worthy of actually exploring in more detail. So, partially agree with Ben Shapiro, partially disagree with him. He hates the film, and I think it's great up until the last 30 to 45 minutes. He said it was 1 million minutes long. That's pretty funny. I think I actually want to give him a credit for being pretty funny in that clip. I do, though. I'm not going to say it's a 10 out of 10. I think it's about a 6.5 out of 10. That's where I would probably put it on my scale. So he's partially right. I partially agree with him, but overarchingly, I don't agree with him fully. So there you go. That's my take on Ben Shapiro's take on the Batman. Let me know what your takes are in the comments down below.